but like I've talked about who is mobbed, who we found is mobbed in our limited study, and now I'm going to look at why organisations allow the behaviour to continue. So I've just wanted to say a little bit about psychological violence. You know, this is something that it's exciting because the International Labour Organisation, Convention 190, has recognised violence and harassment as a range of behaviours including mobbing, intimidation, harassment, discrimination and other conduct. So that's kind of really the umbrella protocol for a lot of work that's being done in Australia in which people can make claims for psychological injury due to mobbing. So that's been very important. And it certainly widens it further than the traditional notions of bullying, which is a very powerful thing. So first of all, conflict, we know, occurs in every workplace, and conflict alone does not explain psychological injury. Injury becomes foreseeable when organisational systems repeatedly reinforce difference, silence vulnerable voices, and fail to recognise the psychosocial hazards surrounding the conflict. The important distinction between an interpersonal disagreement and an organisationally sustained process. When poor leadership, power imbalance, exclusion and procedural unfairness continue over time, the organisation becomes part of the cause as to why a person is forced out. And intervention itself, organisational intervention, can actually add another layer of harm, as I'm sure many people here will have realised that or experienced it. So, as I mentioned quickly earlier, when workers speak up, they reasonably expect protection, fairness, a competent investigation, support and a genuine attempt to resolve the problem. But what many describe in our research is that they're faced with disbelief, extra scrutiny, they're further isolated and blamed, and ultimately they incur psychiatric injury and are forced to exit the workplace. There's a big gap between expectation and what actually happens. I just wanted to go through the 5 phases of mobbing because in my work, in these reports that we prepare, we align closely with these 5 phases, and I'm always very loath to move away from the layman model. So this is something I don't need to go into detail because you will already be well aware of this. And you know, I'm just amazed at how frequent this is proved over and over and over, at least 200 times in the cases that I've worked with. So the phases are not always neat or linear, so I've discovered. You know, they can vary around. You know, it might be that phases 3 and 4 particularly might overlap, but generally it's pretty spot on. And the key thing that I've kind of wanted to focus on in this presentation is phase 3. And I call this where organisations lose control. And this is the point at which they can make a difference. You know, once management, they sort of join in and adopt the dominant narrative without first assessing the risk, or, you know, they can really accelerate the target's exclusion and actively work with the perpetrators to force the person out. And then, so why do so many organisations make things worse after someone reports it? We know mobbing occurs, we know workers are forced out, we know harassment and discrimination occurs. But why do so many organisations make things worse after someone reports it? It's not that they intend to cause injury, not always. I realise there are some cases where, you know, the organisation's just been waiting for this moment, but what we've found is that they don't seem to intend to cause injury. It's the process. Familiar processes are applied through the wrong frame. A complex psychosocial risk is treated as a narrow dispute about whether a particular allegation can be proven. This is the predictable pathway that makes things worse. An initial conflict is followed by a complaint. Management responds usually by conducting an investigation. The focus moves from the workplace system to the individual target. Organisational support reduces, the worker's distress increases, and the process ends in psychological injury and forced exit. So management involvement is usually an intervention within an already unsafe system. And when we get to these investigations, this is a very common intervention. It's a very simplistic approach, and it gets down to, can we substantiate this allegation? So when workers report what's happened, the organisation usually gets in an external investigator, or not always external, and the questions are, can we substantiate this allegation? While the question is legitimate, it's too narrow as the starting point. It directs attention to proof of isolated incidents rather than asking what has happened or whether the worker is currently safe, what power relations exist, and what conditions allow the situation to develop. It also assumes that an investigation is the first and primary response, when immediate risk controls may be required before fact-finding begins. So in Australia, we've got a history whenever anyone makes a complaint, and it may be this case in Canada too, but it's like considered good practice to immediately go to investigation processes, which are notoriously unfair, procedurally unfair. So investigations are intended to reduce organisational risk, but poorly designed investigations increase exposure, isolation, distress, and reputational damage. And they can also increase the level of psychological injury. Workers usually remain in the same sort of work location. They have to repeatedly recount traumatic events or continue interacting with the perpetrators, which can increase harm. Confidentiality may fail in practice, even when, policies will say that confidentiality is essential. The organisation should therefore assess not only the original complaint, but also the risks created by the investigation itself. So that's the move in Australia, is to, instead of just hitting investigations, start looking at looking at the risks, the psychological risks. Okay, so I call it the investigation trap. Organisations investigate events or incidents rather than systems. They ask who said what, on what date, and whether a policy clause was breached. But those questions do not reveal why the behaviour persisted, or why others joined or remained silent, or why earlier warning signs were not acted upon. The fundamental error is confusing the investigation of allegations with the management of organisational behaviour or the management of psychosocial risk. Both may be necessary, but they are different tasks and require different expertise. So at the moment we have lots of investigations, people happily investigating people who probably didn't need to be investigated in the first place. It was more the organisational behaviour. And the target is blamed. So phase 4, layman's model, where the target is blamed, or sometimes referred to as mentally ill, that kind of thing. Common features include selective or trivialised allegations against the target. Oh my, haven't we ever seen such trivial allegations against people? It's just unbelievable. If they're different to the dominant group, these trivial allegations are kind of exaggerated and escalated to really demonise the target. Often they're not told even the reasons why they're being investigated. Can you believe it? They're very vague and general sorts of allegations that just don't make any sense. And I'm surprised to still see that, despite all the work around fair processes. Policies are often applied inconsistently, and I've talked before about putrid practices. hearsay is accepted without proper testing. You know, it's the grapevine seems to have more power than the actual facts. And relevant documents or earlier complaints are excluded. Often terms of reference for these investigations are so restricted to particular incidents that all of the major traumatising types of behaviours are not included. They're seen as irrelevant. Another difficulty is counting witnesses rather than examining power and independence. So if we gather enough witnesses to support the perpetrators, then their version of events is considered truth. Investigators also, because they assess each incident separately, they obscure the cumulative psychological effect or shift attention to the target's personality, communication style, or even medical history. So that we see that quite a lot, that underneath the trivial accusations are things to do with the target's personality, communication style, and their medical history. Often in these investigations, there might be, say, 3 or 4 allegations that are identified by the target, and a finding usually comes back that these cannot be substantiated. So, because the available evidence did not meet the selected threshold, it does not establish that the conduct did not occur, but it does leave the person feeling, well, the person's left out on a limb completely, because once those findings come in that these can't be substantiated, the organisation just kind of wipes their hands and says, well, we investigated it, there was nothing there, couldn't be substantiated, everybody go back to work now and be happy. Doesn't work like that, as you know. So what investigators usually ask, so it gets down to this: who said what, when, and can anyone corroborate it? Was policy breached? And these are the conventional sorts of evidentiary questions that take place in police-style investigations. And the limitation is that they reduce organisational processes and relational issues to a series of isolated transactions. They may establish some facts without explaining the environment that produced them or the ongoing risks to health. And my concern about those is this sort of investigation is that it completely trivialises the person's accusations, because, you know, it's a reductionist method of taking an allegation and reducing it to its minimum so that it sounds petty and trivial. But when you add them all up, it's quite a case. So what should they ask? Why is this conflict occurring? What psychological hazards exist? Who holds the power? What organisational conditions allow this behaviour? And what risks exist for psychological injury? So it's not about abandoning procedural fairness. What we're looking for is the risk management lens that is so often missing. We're looking for leadership conduct, work design, reporting structures, organisational change, role ambiguity, lack of support and group dynamics.
5 minutes, Linda. 5 minutes left.
Okay, so I promised I'd talk about psychosocial hazards. This is a big word that I'm still getting my tongue around. So in Australia, these psychosocial hazards, it's really, I'm just blown away that whoever got this through the powers that be has done an amazing job, because this is part of our health and safety legal system, that these are recognised psychosocial hazards, which all link so beautifully with workplace mobbing. Poor leadership, poorly managed relationships, the role ambiguity, poor organisational justice, poorly managed change, organisational change and restructures, discrimination, workplace violence. We have a bit of that going on in Australia, where it's actual physical violence and assaults, and failure of procedural fairness. That is huge. And why complaints fail, it's not because the behaviour did not occur, but because psychological abuse rarely produces documents, video or independent witnesses. Much of the conduct occurs through tone, exclusion, changing expectations, withheld information and repeated small acts. Each act may appear ambiguous. The meaning emerges from pattern, context, timing and cumulative effect. A fair inquiry therefore tests consistency across the chronology and looks for indirect evidence, rather than demanding the kind of proof usually unavailable in workplace relationships. So organisational justice is more than the final outcome. This is something that's really being pushed in Australia, which is quite exciting to hear. It doesn't mean that things are changing, don't get me wrong, but it is something that we can hang out, you know, we can argue. It gives us a platform to discuss this from, a very important platform. Just one of the comments I wanted to make, that even if even if a worker dislikes an outcome, they are more likely to accept it if the process is transparent and respectful. While this is kind of obvious to reasonable people out there in the world of work, this is not understood. And why leaders struggle? The reason why leaders, people in positions of power, in our study anyway, the reasons we've put it down to is that they're seeking to protect reputations or senior staff, they fear litigation, they focus on policy compliance, even if it makes no sense whatsoever, avoid conflict or fall into confirmation bias. Many also lack specialist knowledge of psychosocial hazards. They don't recognise that if a person is in a seriously, psychological unwell state and is even escorted to hospital, they don't recognise that as a symptom of psychological injury. The legal defence mindset is very strong, and that's particularly powerful. Once the organisation frames the complaint as a threat to be contained, it prioritises defensibility over learning and safety. Protecting the institution's short-term reputation can ultimately create greater legal, financial and human consequences. But we see this all the time, as I'm sure you do. It's the way organisations operate. They must protect their reputation, whatever that might mean to them, at all costs. So the unintended consequences of all of this is investigation fatigue, hypervigilance, loss of trust, post-traumatic stress, major depression, moral injury and loss of employment. These are not merely individual health outcomes, they affect families, careers, teams and the organisation's capacity to learn. Moral injury is especially relevant when a worker believes the organisation has betrayed its stated values or punished them for acting ethically, and that's where the whistleblower concept comes in as well.
1 minute.
Okay. By the time the worker exits, the original conflict may become only one part of the injury. The response itself is experienced as greater harm. Okay. So we need to shift the question. Instead of did workplace mobbing occur, we need to ask what organisational conditions allowed this to happen. And that's where the psychological hazards come into play in Australia. Because
Okay, time out.